Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Storytelling for Impact, Crafting DEI Strategies that Resonate. My name's Oscar Gomez. I'm the CEO and founder of Sojago, and I'm also your facilitator and presenter today. Thank you for joining us. Before we go on, I just want to acknowledge something that you might see might be a little bit of an issue later, is that in our webinar yesterday, I forgot to hit the record button for the first 7 or 8 minutes, so I am re-recording that session. You might see some difference here or there, but it was probably just easier than sort of re-recording the whole thing. And we also wanted to capture and preserve a little bit of sort of the energy from the webinar and the discussion afterwards. So I'll continue. As I mentioned yesterday, I acknowledged and thanked our content marketing coordinator, Fabiana Tamborino, who joined us from Maracaibo, Venezuela. She's been working with us for about 3 months now, and she's been instrumental in planning and putting together this webinar, including the slides and the companion workbook that you received. And I encourage you to have that workbook handy, because I'll be referencing it at different points today. Here's the webinar overview. My goal is to wrap up the presentation in about 45 minutes or less. You can submit questions via the chat feature during the presentation, and I'll answer them afterwards. While you look over the topics to be covered, I want to mention that at various points, I'll briefly reference the content of the workbook, like I said, to help expedite things. So for example, I may reference the definitions in the workbook instead of going into much details about them to help move things along. Real quickly, we're going to start off with sort of why we tell stories, right? Why human beings, it's fundamental to human beings. You can see in your workbooks that we also have a little bit of we captured a little bit of the science behind storytelling and sort of what it does to our brains, why human beings gravitate to stories. Then we're going to talk briefly about sort of storytelling and narrative building. Propose definitions, kind of demystify them a little bit. As you see here, we'll go into sort of the history of storytelling and, the history of storytelling and DEI, which is really rooted in social justice and civil rights and social change, predominantly from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We'll then cover what I think is one of the most important topics in storytelling, is the principles around storytelling, ethical principles. And then we'll kind of, once we've got that sort of that broad view of storytelling and narrative change and definitions and sort of the frameworks, I'll then make connections to storytelling and some of the applications. Storytelling to foster a culture of inclusion and belonging, storytelling to advance health equity, also storytelling and leadership development. And towards the end, I'll tell you a little bit about Sojago and why we do this work, the services that we offer, and we'll wrap up in next steps. So as we go on, people usually ask me why the name Sojago, and in keeping with the theme and concept of storytelling and narrative, Sojago is a nod and tribute to my parents. The 3 syllables there represent them, Socorro and Jose Gomez, Sojago. And to put it very simply, is because I am a continuation of their stories. So I'm a continuation of their hopes, their dreams, their inspirations of why they came to the US from Mexico, why they worked so hard for many years. And so, I'm a continuation of their story. And so in keeping with that, that's where the name Sojago comes from. All right, let's move on. So why we share stories, as it says here, storytelling has been fundamental to human history. Human beings have been telling and listening to one another's stories since before recorded history. Just imagine human beings at very early on gathering around a fire. We've been doing so ever since, in order to make sense of the world around us, maybe to provide answers to existential questions, to honor and memorialize people and events, to entertain one another and ourselves, to laugh and connect with others, thus belonging, and even to organize and mobilize around a cause, which kind of has implications for health equity. People have continued to tell stories through history to counter prevailing narratives or to replace them with newer ones. Again, a theme and applicability to health equity. Storytelling is so fundamental to our human experience that we go about our daily lives even repeating and acting out our internal stories, our own narratives that we tell ourselves consciously or unconsciously, because that's how we're making sense of the world, that's how we're interpreting things. And this is kind of refers to as narrative identity, which we'll talk about briefly when we talk about leadership development. A couple other things to point out here is that people organize around common stories. The major concepts, the constructs that we have in the world, money, since, but when civilization started forming and they moved from the barter system, the concept of money was created and people started telling stories about what monies are, right? National identities are based on stories and themes and myth and legends. And also, finally, what I think is perhaps the most powerful and transformative aspect of stories is that stories build a communal experience, right? They not only build community, but communal in the sense that there's something that transcends in storytelling, right? People connect on a deeper level, and they connect across time, because oftentimes stories, we can tell stories, right? But oftentimes stories are read at a later point. They are seen or experienced again at a different point, such as through film or movies, right? So that's what we refer to when we say a communal experience. All right, so let's some general definitions about story and storytelling. It's pretty straightforward. I do want to demystify them, but it's important to really understand what we're talking about here, right? One main takeaway is, like I said, that we want to demystify the storytelling process. Real simply, there's a protagonist, occasionally more than one, who's acting or moving towards an intended destination goal, and challenge or barriers or problems are encountered in the process, and it ends in some sort of resolution. Now, it seems very straightforward, but it's important to just keep this simple framework in mind to distinguish it from things like messaging, right, which is in marketing. So marketing messages are not reliant on story. If we start getting into brand can really be built upon stories, right? So that's a key distinction here. Some key components about storytelling that I'd like to point out here are that one, the process, it's a process, it's an act, even a ritual, if you will, of sharing a human experience. It involves two or more parties, right? And actually, the concept of storytelling, there's two parts in it. There's a telling of the story, or the sharing of the story, and the listening of the story, or the now with sort of film and other technologies is the visuals, seeing and hearing the story. And today's storytelling occurs in many forms, like I just mentioned, writing, orally, videos, and other technologies. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I do want to talk about just the power and the communal aspect of stories that, storytelling is not necessarily bound by time. So here are a couple of the definitions that I want to share, because we're going to address these a little bit later. And they go to narrative. So narrative is a compilation of stories. So it's more than, say, 3 or 4, right? There has to be several stories that essentially, like any set or group of items, the compilation of stories share something in common, whether they're common values, themes, or visions. Narratives are either assembled or identified or observed. So there's an analytical process to narrative, right? Whether you're conscious or unconscious, you're looking for common themes. And so when you're crafting stories and telling stories, there's a curating process in them. You're looking at what are the themes that you want to convey, what are the shared values, what's the shared purpose. And so if you're compiling narratives, those are your guidelines. That's how you're compiling the sets. Narrative building, or narrative change, it's called, requires an intended goal or outcome. So it's intentional and it's strategic. The definition proposed here reflects narrative with the DI lens. So for example, I'll give you a narrative change. It requires, we're basically countering or trying to change an established story that's out there. We'll go into a little bit later when we talk about types of stories, types of narratives. But I'll give you an example of the narrative change or narrative building. Um, one of our first projects with storytelling and DEI work was with the Latino civil rights groups, the national civil rights groups. I'm not sure. I think we may have somebody here from Unidos US on the webinar, but essentially, you know, the goal there was to really identify what it means to be an emerging leader of color, or really, in this case, Latino, Latinx emerging leader of color. So we interviewed young leaders, emerging leaders that were identified by their community, and we captured their stories, listened to their stories, and then we took those themes out, and then from those we got a composite of what it means to be uh, a young emerging leader from a Latino community. And the themes are so strikingly different from most of the themes that you see in common uh, leadership fellowships or leadership trainings, right? Because in them, I won't go into too much detail, but the things that stood out in them was the importance of lived experience, which we don't necessarily see when we're looking at leadership development. There's usually skill sets, but also there was an intention to revisit shared experience, even difficult ones, right? And it wasn't necessarily to revisit trauma, but there was a theme about sort of revisiting these difficult experiences and observing them, analyzing, growing from them, and learning from them, and then applying. So that's an example of sort of an entire narrative change strategy and the impact it can have. And again, we'll go into that a little bit more uh, as the webinar progresses. Okay, so now that we've briefly reviewed and discussed what narrative and narrative change strategies are, I want to illustrate the impact of storytelling and narrative building on civil rights and social change in the US, particularly during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Now, there are numerous examples, but I barely have time to just point out three. So let's start with how Dr. Martin Luther King powerfully leaned into storytelling to take control of the narrative regarding civil rights. Now, Dr. King understood both the power of storytelling and television, which was a new mass medium that was being sort of just coming into people's homes, right? And so rather than trying to quote unquote make the case for civil rights, Dr. King leans into stories about human dignity, about our shared humanity, and essentially stories that painted a vision for what a truly fair and just American society looked like. It's also worth pointing out that Dr. King also knew how powerful the images of brutality and violence towards peaceful, nonviolent activists would be to Americans who, up until that point, had been ambivalent about the civil rights movement. Now, another example I want to point out here is Cesar Chavez, who was a civil rights leader for the farm worker movement and also considered a civil rights leader and icon for Latina communities. Uh, what he did, his strategy was rather straightforward and direct. Cesar Chavez utilized storytelling essentially to organize and mobilize farm worker families and also to recruit allies. And what he did differently about storytelling is that he talked about stories not that brought attention to the plight of farm workers, but he essentially brought attention to their humanity, to their hopes, and to their cause. And that ended up proving to be incredibly effective to organize for boycotts, what have you, and it's quite successful. And finally, the third example I'm going to use is Harvey Milk, who, as you may know, is the civil rights leader and icon for the LGBT community. Now, he used similar strategies specifically to encourage gay, lesbian, and queer people to share their personal stories and come out. Now, I'm going to read and paraphrase one of the stories that he so effectively used to mobilize LGBT communities nationwide. So you'll probably see me reading the screen here, but let me point this out because it's super powerful. He said, somewhere in Des Moines or San Antonio, there's a young gay person who all of a sudden realizes that he or she is gay, knows that if their parents find out, they will be toughed out of their house. Their classmates will taunt the child. And that child has two options: staying in the closet or suicide. And then one day that child might open the paper that says, homosexual elected in San Francisco. And now there are two new options. The option is to go to California or stay in San Antonio and fight. 2 days after I was elected, I got a phone call, and the voice was quite young. It was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, and the young person said, thanks. It's very important to really keep in mind that storytelling requires ethics, like um, any other relationship or service between two people in a professional setting. There's ethics involved. So ethical storytelling, first and foremost, is rooted in human dignity. It's about uplifting people. And what that includes, it's an ongoing collaborative process. So whether you're telling your story or encouraging other people to tell their stories, it's to keep in mind that there's more than one party involved. So if it's just you telling your story, you keep the listener in mind. What is it that you're going to put out there? What message are you putting out there? But if you're doing storytelling work, let's say if you're encouraging people to tell their stories, say for inclusion and belonging in the workplace, or if you're doing this for health equity work, to get people to mobilize, for either for policy change or for them to sort of feel empowered to change their own situation, the most important thing is to realize that it's a collaborative process, that the storyteller that you are working with is the expert in their story, right? And you lean into that and you position them as experts. Another principle of ethical storytelling is that values relationship building to build trust and consent. So, I'm trying to stay on the positive side here, but, I've seen situations where people request to hear other people's stories, and basically they send them a waiver and ask them to sign. That, in my opinion, that is not ethical, an ethical storytelling approach, because signing a consent paper is really the process of mitigating legal risk. What you want to do in building is that you take the time to build that relationship with that person, to ask them about the story, to listen, to be engaged in, and to stay with them throughout the process. It also requires transparency. So you think of all of these things. Once you do all these things, that's when you've established consent. And then that's when the paperwork comes in. I believe your workbook goes into this a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier, ethical storytelling recognizes that people are experts in their own stories and they're positioned that way. Another thing about ethical storytelling is that it portrays individuals as multifaceted and whole human beings. And, I've seen a lot of progress and a lot of change in the last 20 years in terms of stories. You'll remember that, some of us will remember that about 20 years ago, we would have commercials that were trying to get people to, to support and donate, whether it was here in America or in other parts of the world. And they were just images of children who were in rags and sort of that looked sad or depressed. One, it was tokenizing, right? But more importantly, it was one-dimensional and really unethical. But we've changed a lot since then. But again, if you're engaging in storytelling, encouraging other people to tell their stories, ensure that you're showing all aspects of being a human being, not just. And it takes work to get people to be multifaceted and still tell their story towards an intended goal. Along those same lines is the concept of asset framing versus deficit framing. And I'm going to demystify these terms. Asset framing means that we're telling stories that that convey people's dignity, their hope, their successes, their triumphs, in spite of in spite of the barriers and challenges in their journeys. Deficit framing is the opposite, is when the focus is on the plight, on the difficulties, right? So I'll give an example here. It's a very simple example, but I think it's powerful. Early on when I when I launched Soja Go and I was trying to figure out, just building a network, I was attending several conferences in the social impact world, right? Because I felt, this is a natural fit, and it was. But they asked me to write a bio, and I did, and I sort of shared my journey and stuff. And the person that was, and I was presenting at that conference, and so when they were presenting me, the person that was facilitating, I'm sure she had a lot of things on her mind, everything, but it was clear that she did not read my bio, and instead sort of ad-libbed. And I just remember her focusing on the word. Oscar's done a lot of this work, and he's faced so much adversity in his life, and so he has a lot to tell you about DEI. And I remember in that moment, being a little upset and trying to figure out, do I address this now or not? I think I spoke with her afterwards. But the thing is, what really struck me, that really inspired me to really dig into this, was that when she didn't know my story, she didn't know if there was adversity or not. It was, this was something that, it was a talking point. It was a very comfortable talking point that, this person had sort of internalized and sort of just started repeating that, a person of color, Latino, Black, gay, whatever, that there's adversity. Yes, I did face adversity, but my story, like the story of so many other people, is not about adversity. It's about the success. It's about the resilience. It's about the innovation. So all of these other things. So that's an example of asset framing and deficit framing. And so, and that's just me, but so one of the work, that's why I was very excited to work with Unidos US a few years ago, because that is what that project was doing. It was saying, we need to change and really challenge the talking points that have become comfortable for most people about what it means to be a person of color, a leader of color, and really just move away from this deficit framing and asset framing. I feel like I've gone on about it, but I really want to stress that, because that is so important, and I think it's a key takeaway. Finally, I want to show that an ethical storyteller always asks, what stories am I telling, and what power am I using to tell them? So ethical story always recognizes power dynamics, which is another key. Power dynamics is essential to health equity work, because you are to really challenge equity, is you want people to leverage power, to wield and leverage power. It also has implications with leadership, because a good leader knows how to share and redistribute power. So in any case, ethical storytelling is always, what stories am I telling, and what power am I using to tell them? What power do I have to transform things, and am I using this power thoughtfully? So I want to go into a little bit more specifically on, let's start applying this to some of the concepts that we talked about, DEI concepts. So storytelling and belonging, if we look at sort of, keep in mind sort of what we just covered, and also I encourage you to reference the definitions in your workbook. There's inclusion and belonging. I'll briefly mention inclusion. Inclusion in a nutshell is creating and maintaining a space where everybody knows that they can be exactly who they are, without having to edit themselves, without having to hide something. And if they choose to do that, it's because it's their choice to not do so. But that's at the core of what inclusion is to encourage people to be exactly who they are, and by that, knowing that they're going to bring their best self out in what they're doing. Belonging is that second part of it. Belonging, and here's the definition that I have. Belonging is about is the opposite of fitting in. In fact, what is her name? Brene Brown has a wonderful quote, but I'm probably not going to be able to capture exactly. But I think she says something along the lines: that the biggest barrier or the biggest challenge to belonging is fitting in, right? Because when you're fitting in, you're editing parts of yourself. So when we relay this back to storytelling, belonging basically begins with comfort and safety. And when we mean comfort and safety, it's what we just talked about, encouraging people to be exactly who they are, and knowing that there will not be repercussions for that. They will not be judged. They will not be felt to made to feel bad about them. So think of comfort and safety in those terms, right? But then the other two steps, storytelling and belonging is connection, right? And connection is really, so I'm trying to capture my notes here. Connection involves shared and or communal experience where a predetermined outcome is not involved. So what that means is that connection in the workplace goes beyond and is not sort of people collaborating on the same project. It's people connecting separate from a project or separate from an intended goal, right? And just getting to know one another. So again, just think of connection, and let's go back to some of the things that we talked about, the power of storytelling, right? Where people connect and have that communal experience. And then the third component of belonging and storytelling really is contribution. And by contribution, it's a shared purpose, right? Where a team of people are basically working towards a common purpose, even if they have different roles and responsibilities. So it's where people with different personal narratives who often have different roles and responsibilities are able to understand how, as a group, they are working towards the same vision, mission, or outcome. Now, if you're a leader or a person who's really trying to incorporate storytelling and belonging towards that, it's important to look at stories that really touch upon and acknowledge these three steps, right? If people are going to tell their stories, there's going to be a space where they are encouraged, that they won't be judged, they won't have to feel edited about the stories they tell. It's important to share why you're encouraging storytelling, and that's because you want people to connect and get to know each other separate from work or a work project. And finally, as the person leading that storytelling and belonging, is that you want people to share stories as to how they've contributed, what is their role in a shared purpose, and to be recognized for that, right? So the other people say, oh, I work in finance. Now I see how the person at front desk sort of and I are working towards the same goal, right? So that's a quick primer on storytelling and belonging. So a few more things to consider about belonging. I mentioned earlier, if you are the person who's in charge of trying to bring, or if you're taking the initiative to create belonging through storytelling, it is essential to create and maintain a safe space and a trusting space. To be transparent, and again, to let people know that there won't be repercussions, there won't be any shaming, any judgment in their stories. Here's a tip if you're gonna lean into storytelling, is to create small opportunities for teams to share stories, right? Be the catalyst for that. Again, I'm gonna refer you to your workbook where we go into a little more details as to what that looks like. Right? And again, storytelling for belonging, if you're going to take the lead in doing that, before you actually set out, listen. Listen to the people's stories before even sharing your own. One tip that I remind myself, and I encourage others to folks, if you're not necessarily the best listener, which I've become a much better listener over time, but I realize I have to practice becoming an active listener. I remind myself that the focus in storytelling, if I'm leading a storytelling group, the focus for me is to focus less on being interesting and to focus more on being interested in others, right? So think about that when you're leading that. It's that it's always about sort of being interested in other people and not necessarily about ourselves. So if we're looking at storytelling and leadership, storytelling leadership is really connected to a concept called narrative identity, which I believe it's German psychology, I believe. I learned about it through a leadership fellowship that focused on social justice and social impact. But essentially, narrative identity and leadership development, it refers to the personal stories that we construct and tell ourselves on a daily basis. So being a more effective leader through storytelling requires intentionally understanding and revisiting our own internal stories and narrative. If you really want to become a great storyteller, begin by understanding and then sharing your own story. And within that process, it requires sort of some self-reflection and inventory, and begin by saying, asking yourself, what narratives have you accepted and internalized and acted upon, right? Also want to mention that sharing your own stories can be challenging at first. It can feel raw to tell parts of our stories. There's vulnerability because you put something out there and you don't necessarily know how it is going to be received. And I encourage you to just walk through that rawness, that vulnerability, that fear. If you don't know where to start, we have some suggestions that are in the workbook. And I think a great place to start with your own story is by just asking a question: what are 3 or 4 events in your life, at any point in your life, whether it's your childhood, whether it's in high school? For me, college was a big place where that impacted me. And then maybe parts in your career. Identify 3 or 4 events that have really influenced you as a leader. And I think a very effective way to do this is to draw them. Don't write, begin by drawing. And you can do stick figures if you're not the most. But there's when we facilitated retreats, we begin, oftentimes storytelling is we start very early with that. Leadership, the fellowship that I was involved in, it was rooted in storytelling, and that's where it began. And really, we started by drawing. I'm going to try not to go off on a tangent, but the arts, whether it's performing arts, film, art, drawing, whatever, painting, they're rich in DEI and they're rich in storytelling. But do that. Just draw those stories, draw them out, and then look at them. And then you can practice telling people about the 3 or 4 drawings that you have there. And that's a great way to sort of essentially get out of our own heads, right? And start capturing that story. So there's one thing that I encourage you to do after this webinar is that exercise, to begin with your own story. And if you're going to work with other people to tell stories, use a similar exercise, right? Encourage them to just draw, let the prompt question, to draw 3 or 4 events that have shaped their leadership story, to draw 3 events that sort of describe why they do the work that they do. Just think of that prompt question, encourage people to draw that story and to draw the events and then talk about them, right? So in terms of leadership, I would say, as leaders, this is how I would encourage leaders to start, that is by their own stories. And oftentimes when I work with leaders on storytelling and coaching, most leaders want to begin with saying, okay, well, I want to tell a story about this. How do I tell a story about the kid? And I sort of always bring them back to begin with their own story. And then once you understand that story, you understand themes, you get a lot of insight. And then from there, you can take nuggets of your stories, right? I just noticed time, so I'm going to move along with here. So if you're looking at storytelling and leadership development, I would encourage you to follow these 4, this 4-step process and to be intentional. If you're telling your leadership story, think about the vision, purpose, and values of you and the group that you're telling the story to. How are they aligned? Bring in that emotional intelligence that you have, right? What stories are you going to tell? Why are you telling that story, right? What is it that you're trying to convey? Not in terms of the message, but the feeling, the emotions that you're trying to convey, and that you want people to resonate with them and connect with you on those stories. Again, remember that storytelling, when we're telling our own stories as leaders, it requires leaning into empathy with others. You're looking at sort of how you're going to tell stories that people can not just empathize with you, but you so convey empathy with them, that there's a shared journey that you have there, and lean into that vulnerability. And finally, as a leader telling stories, always keep in mind that as leaders, we're always thinking in the moment and stuff, but leaders really essentially, there's always legacy and impact. And that's what people are going to remember. They're certainly going to remember accomplishments and stuff, but in the end, people are going to remember sort of what are the key things that you've left there. How did you make them feel? Did you celebrate an achievement? Did you celebrate an outcome? Was there stories around them? What is the story that people are going to tell when you're no longer in that position? Okay, I'm going to keep this moving along. Storytelling and health equity, I mentioned this earlier. Real quickly, I want to talk about sort of the process for storytelling and health equity. And again, this has implications for inclusion and also leadership development. But essentially, you can categorize, if you're looking at building narratives, you look at stories and you categorize them. You can categorize them in 4 different groups. There's stock stories, right? And stock stories essentially are dominant stories that are passed on through history and literary documents. Think about the stock stories about, in America, about sort of raising people who raise themselves on their own bootstraps. That's a dominant narrative that really leaves a lot of people out, right? And so I'll give you another example. Conversations that I've had with the SCAN Foundation, who works with with seniors, right? Especially low-income seniors. One of the things that we talked about with them is sort of that the narrative that's out there of what retirement is, right? The stock story is about golden years. But if you really look at, if you move into concealed stories about seniors, the communities that they're trying to work with, the seniors, they're not necessarily their golden years. They don't have the life that's sort of conveyed in commercials about travel and stuff. There's many seniors that they work with in many communities that are living either just above or below the federal poverty line. So those are concealed stories, right? And concealed stories, they've revealed broader truths. So then we go into resistance stories. And resistance stories are strategically curated to challenge prevailing narratives, as it says here. I don't have I could have an example, but I'm noticing time here. So just think about stories that sort of really challenge stock stories and dominant stories and say, like, no, that stock story is not representative of the communities or my personal story. And then from that, you get emergent stories, right? And these are new stories that are constructed to counter dominant narratives. Like concealed stories, they challenge the status quo, but there's another piece to them. These emergent stories, what they create is that they enable imagination. They inspire, they provide hope, and they can help people organize and mobilize towards action. If you're looking at storytelling and health equity, here's a quick way to sort of assemble that, is that you look at what are your goals and objectives? Is it a policy change? Is it that you want to recruit new members? Do you want to do coalition building? You have those objectives. You connect that with the strategy of your work. You collect the data or the stories that we mentioned. The observation analysis, real quick framework, is that you can sort of curate them into the 4 categories that I just described. And then you share the stories and findings. This is a very simple and straightforward process. It's a lot more complicated than that. You have to sort of layer that with ethical storytelling that I mentioned, but that is essentially a quick primer storytelling in that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about Sojo Go because I want to answer any questions that may have come up. The only thing you can read them here. Our approach, I think, of what makes us a little different is that we really embrace storytelling as part of our work, peer-to-peer information, And our DEI work is based on applied business and executive experience versus academic and compliance frameworks. I do want to say that we don't have listed here, but over the month of June, we are going to be rolling out a whole new series of services that really focus on DEI and storytelling. We'll send out an email. You'll learn about them via email or social media. We encourage you to visit our website. If you're not connected to us on LinkedIn, or I think we also have an Instagram page that Fabiana has been curating. Connect with us there. You'll get lots of information. I finally want to thank you for joining us. We welcome your feedback. Shortly after this this webinar, you're going to receive a survey. We're going to email you a survey, and we really encourage you to give us that feedback. It only makes us do better work. Don't hold back necessarily. Tell us sort of what you think, what you worked. We do ask for your consent in some of those places if we can share some of your stories. And again, don't feel that you have to consent to them, but we would love that. Please complete that. Also, we just want to point out that in there, if you saw I don't know if you noticed it on some of the promotional information, but the survey towards the end, you'll also notice in there that there's a question about sort of a promotional offer or offers that we're asking. So if you've attended this webinar, you can select a complimentary session, whether it's feedback on, say, your on a storytelling project that you're doing. If you have very specific questions about today's webinar, we engage one-on-one, or we can send you excerpts from some of the materials that we've done on storytelling. We can, for example, I'm happy to share with you team building activity. So please select one of those options. And again, they're complimentary. We're just happy for you to join us. We are at 11:50, so there's about 10 minutes here. If you want to connect with us on LinkedIn, you can just scan, or Instagram, you can just scan these QR codes here, and that'll sign you up. And let me just see if there's any questions here that I can answer. We've got compliments. And we've got questions about, we posted a recording. We are going to post we are going to record this and post this. We're probably not going to do this right away. It'll probably be over the next couple of weeks. And we still haven't decided whether we're going to post them on LinkedIn. We really want to encourage people to start visiting our YouTube channel, which is going to be it's going to be exclusive for people in our network. So once we decide those things, probably give us another couple of weeks, and we will share and post those with you. And let me see here if there's any questions. I'm going to pause here. I don't see any questions. I think if you have a question, you can, don't feel like you have to necessarily, Clarisse raised her hand. Let's see. You can unmute yourself and I can answer those questions if you like.
Hi, Oscar. Really wonderful and fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. And I'm definitely going to use this when there are opportunities for me to use these nuggets of wisdom. It really is a whole art. And again, thank you so much. So my question is, you said that to be a good storyteller, you have to be, I believe that you said to be a good storyteller, you must be a good listener. And like, how do you, I guess, develop that? And how do you like signal that you are an active listener to your audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like the way you frame that because it's a practice, right? And a couple of things that I do. So think about what active listening is, and you've probably heard these before, but one, as I mentioned earlier, just think about it when you're doing this. And if you're an extrovert like me, this is something you constantly remind yourself is that really in storytelling, if you're listening, it's more important. Practice. Don't focus on being interesting and focus more on being interested in others, right? Another way to do that is just, I don't know how else to phrase it, but to get out of our head a little bit, right? It's not, in other words, when we're listening, to focus less on how we we're going to respond to somebody or thoughts, and really practice. This is going to sound a little bit out there, but really bring in your heart and your spirit to listening, right? So maybe focus on being less analytical and just allow yourself to just open your heart, your spirit to other people's stories. I'm happy to talk to you more about that. That's a great question. And it's practice and it's a commitment, right? And again, maybe just keep in mind that storytelling, when we listen to people's stories, it really is a privilege and an honor to listen to that. So if we think about that in terms of the sacredness and community and communal experience, I think that might help. Thanks for that question.
Wonderful.
Anybody else?
Hi, Oscar. I had a
Yes.
question. Hi, this is Bahar. Thank you so much. This was amazing.
All right, Bahar. Yeah.
One thing that came up to me, it reminded me of some storytelling retreats I have been to as part of my artist part of me some years back. And you know, in those retreats, I remember that one of the first things was to really get people out of their mind and into their bodies and kind of moving around, you know, doing things that they wouldn't usually do as far as like movements or even kind of making sounds, so that we kind of get out of our minds and start expressing in different ways. And when I was listening to you, as far as like the steps that you put together, like how to kind of do some self-reflection first, as far as what are the stories that you're telling yourself, or what are some of the main events in your life, and then go to the why of it to choose how you want to kind of present your story. It reminded me of that it feels like, to me, it feels like it's like two processes. One is first getting out of the mind, but then going back into reframing, because we're using this in the social justice work, and kind of like the relevance of it becomes important. So my question is, how you yourself have been able to find that balance between you know, your authentic, true story, and then adapting that to the audience, or the why of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, so I'm going to say, you know, there is the mind. There is an analytical and rational side to storytelling, right? And think about that. If you think about it in the work setting or work objective, that's where the rational mind comes in, right? What is the intended goal? You have to do your homework, right? Who's your audience? What are they expecting? What's the topic? So that's where the rational part comes in. And I would say that, you know, I said I'm going to reframe a little bit what I said, and maybe saying, rather than kind of saying that we bounce between rational and heart, is to really focus on being integrated, our full selves, our integrated selves, right? At any moment to do it both with our minds and our heart. And I say spirit, right? Because to me, storytelling, there's a communal aspect that sort of transcends that. So I would say to look at an integrated self. You know, I think practice listening. You know, I happen to know Bahar, Dr. Ramanzada, for a long time, and I've actually participated in some of her art workshops, which are wonderful. And I would say that's a great way to do it. Look at the arts. You know, a quick aside here. Sometimes in my DEI work, sometimes I don't know how intentional it is, but sometimes if I'm kind of stuck or need something, I'll say, you know what, I'm going to take a break this afternoon, and I go and I look to see what movies are being played, because movies have their stories, right? But there's so much connection. People always say, I learn a lot about DEI through music, through arts, through film, right? So that's probably a way to do so. Thank you for that question. Thank you for sharing. I think we have time for a couple more questions or comments.
Well, Oscar, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you for this amazing workshop and presentation. What really resonated with me, and what I took away, was when you talked about what belonging is or what it's not, that inclusion accept people exactly as they are, rather than fitting in, that you are editing yourself. I find that in my professional life and in my other things that I do outside of work, it's helped me. One, I'm not from the US, so I'm an immigrant. I have the language barrier, so to speak. There's an accent. So it's obvious when I speak in English that, you know, I'm not from here, and I feel like I'm always drawn to people who, equally as I am, have an accent, and I reach out to them and I want to know, where you from, what's your story, because I know it's a different story than if you are from here, so to speak. But what I really took away, that accept everybody as they are. I'm a yoga instructor, and so when I go to my yoga class and whoever sits in front of me, everybody is welcome, regardless of your ability, your age, your gender. It does not matter. But it taught me so much to take that into the workplace and equally apply the same thing. I work in emergency medicine, so we don't know who's coming in, but we accept all. So that really, like I said, I had to write it down because that really struck so much, that inclusion, what belonging is. So I thank you for that. If I don't take anything away from it, if I don't remember anything, this is the one that really struck the most. So thank you for that.
Well, great. You know, and stories do that. Stories do that, right? Because when you tell stories and people listen to them and they hear them and you feel that connection, we belong a little more. We are at 12 o'clock, so I understand if people need to log off. I'm happy to stay on 10, 15 more minutes to answer more questions.
Yes, hello. This is Lauren Cruz. I am currently a Digital Equity Fellow at Prosperity Lab, a nonprofit organization based in San Jose. Okay. So part of my work with the organization is, organizing workshops and training on DEL, digital equity. So this is building computer skills for building computer skills for people, for small businesses, and also other nonprofits. And we're currently, thinking about new strategies to keep the participants engaged and have everyone finishing the whole program and not having, enrolled 50 people and just graduating 30 from the group. So it's always a challenge. But just thinking about, some of in the initial interviews, we have identified that some people feel excluded from the group. Even most of the group are initial learners. They need to go to these kind of classes to develop their computer skills, but some of them feel isolated. Some of them feel judged. Some of them feel not from the instructor, of course, but from their other peers, from the other adults in the same group. Some of them feel ashamed to ask questions, and then these are the people that decide not to go back to the next class and just to drop out. So I just found this session like it just made like a click. It just made sense that we need to make sure to have some stories of success, and maybe like reiterating them throughout the classes. Maybe we can record some success stories and just reminding them each class to continue and figure out new ways to help them deal with the sense of not belonging in the class. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, I'd love to chat with you more about that because there's so many things in my mind, and I was trying to practice active listening here. I'll leave you with this quote. If there's one thing I've learned and observed is that practicing active listening, becoming a better listener, one thing it does in terms of belonging is that when we really start listening to other people's stories, after a while you listen to people's stories with your mind and your heart and your spirit, you start seeing parts of your stories in theirs, even if they're completely different than you. It's funny, there's a cliche to say how divided and polarized we are in the US, and it's true. But one of the things I try to focus on is in stories, and I've come across people who sometimes, I sort of make assessments where I know that very different sort of worldviews and stuff. But when you listen to those stories, you are going to see part of yourself in their stories. You always do, because it's our shared humanity, right? And so if you're take that nugget in terms of the work that you do, that the part of the story is that you want people and you want to create a space and encourage people to ask stories or prompt questions where people are going to see themselves in other people's stories. And that's where you start that connection, right? I mean, I really think that storytelling, well, like I said, I think the history of human beings has been around storytelling. If you think everything that we do about national identity, money, but even more applicable, are really stories that we've come to agree upon, right? So anyway, please reach out to me, schedule something. I'm happy to do that. You're not too far from San Jose. So yeah, thank you for that. We have time for a few more comments or questions. Like I said, I can stay on a little bit longer. Anybody else? Okay. If we don't have any more, well, do we? I think people are logging off. Okay, if we don't have any more questions or comments, again, I just want to thank you very much. Please fill out that survey. Reach out to us via email. I'm happy to engage with you, whether even if it's, whether it's formal. I'd love to work with you formally, but if not, via email or a quick chat, because I'm very passionate both about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also about storytelling. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.